morning, good afternoon, good evening. Today, I'd like to address an issue that has been circulating in my social media group. The argument that even if SADC was to uphold the SADC election report that condemned the 23rd August election as a farce and agreed to the formation of a National Transition Authority or a GNU. Some people have been arguing that that National Transition Authority will get nowhere because we have the army. And Zimbabwe is a deep state, and without the army, nothing will change. I totally disagree with that. I think the main problem we have here is that most of those people did not understand what happened in the last GNU. The last GNU, the primary purpose of the 2008 to 2013 GNU was to implement the democratic reforms, which would have freed state institutions from Zanu PF influence, such state institutions as SEC, the army itself, the police, the CIO, the judiciary, and also restore the basic freedoms and rights of the individuals, including the right to a meaningful vote and even the right to life. That task was supposed to be done by those people in the GNU. Any one of the ministers, senators, or member of parliament in that government of national unity could submit a reform proposal. Parliament was then tasked to go through that reform proposal, amend it as they see fit, and approve it. And once it is approved, it will then be passed to Robert Mugabe as the president, state president, who will then sign it, and then the reform will be implemented. That was the process. Not even one meaningful reform proposal was submitted throughout the 5 years of the GNU. One has got to ask why. And the answer is there. Robert Mugabe bribed the eMDC leaders with the trappings of high office, including the ministerial limousines, the very generous salaries and allowances, and for Save himself, Trangirai, a $4 million mansion. And with those bribes, the eMDC guys forgot about the reforms. Zanu PF cronies during the GNU often boasted of how Mazivanhu eMDC adzidza anyerere. At the end of the 2013 election, when it was clear Zanu PF, no reforms had been implemented, and Zanu PF was able to rig the elections, one of the SADC diplomats told the independent newspaper that eMDC leaders were busy enjoying themselves in the GNU and they forgot why they were there. What is disappointing here is Zanu PF and outsiders were aware what was going on during the GNU, but not Zimbabweans themselves. And worse still, even now, many of these Zimbabweans do not even know what was going on during the GNU. And so this whole argument that, oh, we've got to have the army because Zimbabwe is a deep state, the army is heavily involved, and of course that gained even more currency after the 2017 military coup. Yes, it was the army that staged the 2017 military coup. And the 8 months from the coup to the 2018 elections, the army's presence in the government itself could not be denied. There was VP Chiwenga, there was the Minister of Foreign Affairs from the army, Minister of Agriculture, Perence Shiri from the army, and many others in the army were heavily involved in the government. But after 2018 election, the army's role in government was significantly reduced. And the 2023 elections have seen the army's role completely reduced to the presence of VP Chiwenga. And this cartoon I've got showing there is somebody depicting the sorry state of the army. He is now depicted as a scarecrow who can't even scare the crow, much less the marauding baboons. And to be absolutely sure of their loyalty, their old rebs in the trademark scarf, helping themselves to the maize corn. And so to skip talking about Zimbabwe as a deep state, we've got to get the army involved in the National Transition Authority. It's just being ridiculous. It's failing to understand what is going on. The army did not play any role in stopping MDC implementing the reforms during the last GNU. And if the new transition authority was set up, I don't see why we should fear that the army would stop that transition authority implementing the reforms. What should be feared is that, of course, Zanu PF would use its influence in the army, the police, the CIO, and so forth to destabilize the country. That's a different proposition, as distinct from the army itself making Zimbabwe ungovernable, or the police making Zimbabwe ungovernable. It will be Zanu PF using its influence in those institutions to make the country ungovernable. This is why we have got to confront Zanu PF and say to them in no uncertain terms that they cannot hold the nation to ransom. They cannot use the army to hold the nation to ransom. They cannot use the police to hold the nation to ransom. They cannot use the CIO to hold the nation to ransom. The problem will be Zanu PF. It is not impossible to implement the democratic reforms and reforms and reform those institutions, the army, the police, the SEC, and so forth, and break away this influence that Zanu PF has in those institutions. That can be done, and that should be done. Zanu PF would want to create the impression that they can make the country ungovernable. But it is Zanu PF that will be doing it, that will be pulling the strings. Many of the people in the army, the police, the CIO, they are as poor as everybody else. It's only the select few in those institutions who are living, who are filthy rich. And if the nation was to stand up and say, let's reform the system so that it is fairer and it works for everybody, it is really not impossible to see why we should be able to tell those few who are filthy rich that you cannot hold the nation to ransom. Even they themselves would know they are being used by the Zanu PF ruling elite to hold the nation to ransom. I think the cartoon depicts all there is to be said about this myth that Zimbabwe is a deep state. The army is the one dictating the power behind the throne and dictating to the Zanu PF. It's actually the other way around. The Zanu PF ruling elite are using the army to do its dirty work, just as much as they are using ZEC officials to rig the elections, just as much as Zanu PF is using the judges to do their dirty work. Zanu PF ruling elite are the ones pulling the strings. And those are the ones we've got to deal with. We need to confront Zanu PF in no uncertain terms, the ruling elite, and tell them that they cannot hold the nation to ransom. That is what we should focus on. And not be scared of myths that we've got to involve the army in the National Transition Authority in its own right. If the army was to come in, it would be Zanu PF that would be pushing the army to come in. Because as we know, in most of these cases, the army is the army by name only. It's just, otherwise it is just a department of Zanu PF. Just as much as ZEC, we have got the Zimbabwe Election Commission. It's supposed to be an independent body, but it's not. It is just a department of Zanu PF. That's how infiltrated those institutions are. We need to demystify this issue of the influence of the army. Zimbabwe is not a deep state. Zimbabwe can be transformed into a healthy and functioning democracy if we go ahead, bite the bullet, and tell Zanu PF you cannot hold the nation to ransom. Set up a National Transition Authority that will implement all the democratic reforms. All the democratic reforms, including reforming the key institutions like the SEC, the police, the army, etc., but also restoring the fundamental rights and freedoms of the citizens. At the end of the day, the transition authority should deliver the right of every Zimbabwean to a meaningful vote. Free, fair, and credible elections are not just a right, they're absolutely essential for good governance. Zimbabwe is a failed state because for the last 43 years, we failed to hold free, fair, and credible elections. Focus on that. Let's sort that one out. That is the key to ending this cycle of bad governance. I repeat, Zimbabwe is not a deep state. We need to deal with the marauding baboons, the Zanu PF marauding baboons, and not pretend that the army is the number one problem. It is not. The involvement of the army in the economy was at the invitation of Zanu PF leaders, particularly after the 2008 elections. They needed the army to help them beat up people and force them to vote for Zanu PF. The army was just being used. And when they delivered that, Mugabe invited them, gave them concessions in Chiazwa and Marange. And that's where they started their economic activity. Of course, yes, they would want to hang on to it. But it was purely at the invitation of Zanu PF. And most of the army people know that, except for the filthy rich few. The rest of them, they are poor. The army staged the coup in 2017. But now, yes, they've been reduced to a scarecrow that can't even scare the crows, much less the marauding baboons, Zanu PF marauding baboons. We really need to deal with this problem. And I don't think it is an impossible problem. We need to focus on SADC must stand by the SADC election report. They must declare Zanu PF, this Zanu PF regime illegitimate. And then we will need a national transition authority. And we need that national transition authority to have people who are going to implement the democratic reforms. And they should not, that national transition authority should not be compromised by having Zanu PF or Triple C leaders in it. They are the ones who are responsible for getting us into this mess. They are the problem, and they can therefore not be the solution too. We need to focus on what we need to do and do it. Thank you very much, and good day.